and destruction caused by President Putin's war. The determined resistance of the Ukrainians against the invasion, and the importance of our continued support. We all paid tribute to the courage of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian armed forces. NATO allies and partners have supported Ukraine with equipment and training for many years. We are helping Ukraine to uphold its fundamental right to self-defense, freedom and democracy, with significant amounts of critical military equipment. Today, ministers agreed that we must continue to provide significant support to Ukraine, including with military supplies, financial help and humanitarian aid. NATO allies and partners are also hosting millions of Ukrainian refugees. President Putin must stop this war immediately, withdraw his forces now, and engage in good faith. NATO is responding to this crisis with speed and unity. And next week, allied heads of state and government will meet for an extraordinary NATO summit. We will address both our immediate response and the changes we need to make for our longer-term security. Moscow should be in no doubt. NATO will not tolerate any attack on allied sovereignty or territorial integrity. We have already activated our defense plans to shield the alliance, increase our readiness, and deploy troops from both sides of the Atlantic. There are now hundreds of thousands of forces at heightened alert across the alliance, 100,000 US troops in Europe, and around 40,000 troops under direct NATO command, mostly in the eastern part of the alliance, backed by major air and naval power, as well as air defenses. But we face a new reality for our security, so we must reset our collective defense and deterrence for the longer term. Today, we tasked our military commanders to develop options across all domains: land, air, sea, cyber and space. On land, our new posture should include substantially more forces in the eastern part of the alliance, at higher readiness, with more pre-positioned equipment and supplies. In the air, more allied air power and strengthened integrated and missile defense. At sea, carrier strike groups, submarines, and significant numbers of combat ships on persistent basis. We will also consider the future of our cyber defenses and how best to draw on allied space assets. We should also train and exercise more often and in greater numbers. Major increases to our deterrence and defense will require major investments. Allies need to invest a minimum of 2% of GDP on defense. And I welcome that allies such as Germany and Denmark have already made important announcements on more investments and faster timetables. We also need to spend more together. NATO common funding is the essential enabler that allows us to work together. It is a force multiplier for national defense efforts, and it shows solidarity as allies. At this critical moment for our security, unity between North America and Europe in NATO is more important than ever. And with that, I'm ready to take your questions.
Okay, we'll start with BBC in the centre, just behind.
Thank you.
Last row. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Secretary General. Just to ask you, we've heard once again from President Zelensky addressing US Congress, calling for a no-fly zone. Are there any allies at all who have been asking for one, even if the decision of the alliance as a whole is not to enforce one? Has there been any discussion at all about it? And the second question I have is just about Ukraine and its NATO membership. Do you believe that Ukraine has cooled towards its view of joining NATO as a negotiating tool with the hope of eventually reaching some kind of agreement with Russia? Thank you very much.
Allies are united, both in providing support to Ukraine to uphold the right for self-defense, but allies are also united when it comes to that NATO should not deploy forces on the ground or in the airspace of Ukraine. Because we have a responsibility to ensure that this conflict, this war, doesn't escalate beyond Ukraine. We see death, we see destruction, we see human suffering in Ukraine, but this can become even worse if NATO took actions that actually turn this into a full-fledged war between NATO and Russia. So allies are united when it comes to the issue of how to provide support to Ukraine. Ministers addressed this today. They reinforced the message of the importance of providing support with equipment, advanced equipment, air defense systems, anti-tank weapons, many other types of support, but no NATO deployment of air or ground capabilities in Ukraine. That's the united position from the allies. Then the message to Ukraine is the same now as it has been for years, that Ukraine is a sovereign, independent nation. It has its own right to choose its own path. And we respect the decisions made by the democratic elected government by Ukraine. So it's up to them to decide whether they aspire for NATO membership or not, and then it's up for 30 allies to decide on that issue, not for Russia to try to veto such a process.
CNN.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. Natasha Bertram, CNN. I'm wondering whether NATO has invited President Zelensky to participate in any way in the Leader Summit next week, as Reznikov did in the Defense Ministerial today. And I'm also wondering if you could respond to the Polish proposal to send NATO forces into Ukraine on a so-called peacekeeping mission. Thanks.
Also, what we need is peace in Ukraine, and therefore Russia and President Putin to stop the war, withdraw its forces. We support all efforts to find a negotiated solution. We support all efforts to find a diplomatic solution. And of course we support and welcome the talks and negotiations which are now taking place between Ukraine and Russia. At the same time we support Ukraine because we know what they can achieve on the negotiable is of course very closely linked to the situation on the battlefield. So I strongly also believe that one of the reasons why the Ukrainians also are saying that they have seen some steps in the right direction is because they have been able to fight back. They have been able to fight back against the invading Russian forces. So the courage, the determination and the support from NATO allies to the Ukrainian armed forces extremely important also when it comes to what they can achieve as part of negotiated with Russia. Of course, we support peace efforts. We call on Russia to withdraw its forces, but we have no plans of deploying NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine.
Okay. Rai.
Secretary General, good evening. Can you comment on Italy's role in this current crisis, and happy birthday for today.
Thank you. I would very much like to comment on Italy's role. Italy is a highly valued NATO ally, a founding member, and Italy is contributing to our collective defense in many different ways. I was recently in Romania. I met Italian pilots. They are helping there to keep NATO airspace safe, and they really show commitment and strength in their contributions to different NATO missions and operations, including in Kosovo, where Italy has been a key ally for many, many years.
Financial Times, gentleman with glasses.
Thank you. Just to follow up to the question about the peace talks, you said that you're encouraged by signs and that you support any effort to find a diplomatic solution. Could you tell us, are you seeing any signs on the ground that the Russians are genuine in their approach to these peace talks, or that they may well just be using them as a distraction for resupply and for structuring their approach? Thank you.
On the ground, we don't see any sign. And that's the reason why I also call on Russia to engage in these talks in good faith. And it's not for me to report from these talks. NATO are not part of those talks. These are talks between Ukraine and Russia. But I've just seen the reports coming out from those talks. I think it's very important not to speculate and not to prejudge or to preempt any outcome of these talks. But my message was in a way that it is obvious that what Ukraine can achieve around the negotiating table is very closely linked to the situation on the battleground. And therefore the support we give to them to stand up against and to resist the Russian invasion also helps them to achieve an acceptable outcome in the negotiations.
Associated Press.
Lorne Cook from the Associated Press. Could you tell me a little bit more about the tasking that you've given NATO commanders, what that might involve, and are we looking ahead 1 year, or are we talking about a decade, something longer term? And you also used the word persistent. I wonder what that means. Why wouldn't you say on a permanent basis?
This is the way we make these kind of decisions in NATO, is that the politicians, they set out the guidelines, the direction, then we task our military commanders to give advice on how to follow up, and then we make final decisions as politicians based on these advice and input from our military commanders. This was exactly the same we did back in 2016. When we, at the Warsaw Summit, made historic decisions for the first time in our history to deploy NATO combat troops to the eastern part of France. You have to remember that before Ukraine, also before the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014 by Russia, NATO had no combat troops in the eastern part of the alliance. Then we had the illegal annexation of Crimea, and since 2014 we have implemented the biggest reinforcement of collective defense since the end of the Cold War, tripling the size of the NATO response force, establishing the battle groups in the Baltic countries and Poland, more presence in the air, at sea, and of course also started to invest more, increasing defense spending. Then the process was the same. Politicians tasked the commanders, they provided advice, and based on that we developed the final conclusions that Allied heads of state and government made at the summit in 2016. And then since then we have implemented that. I foresee a similar process now. We have tasked the military commanders. We will have their advice within weeks, and then my ambition is that heads of state and government, when they meet at the end of June, can make the decisions on significantly increased presence, reinforcing our deterrence and defense on land, sea and in the air. And of course, this will then depend on the input we get from the commanders, but also, of course, at the end of the day, it has to be a political decision by the leaders. So the decision I foresee within months, as meaning by the summit in June. Then implementation will, of course, vary a bit depending on what kind of decisions we are going to make.
Frankfurt Allgemeine, just behind AB. Just behind.
Thomas Kutschka, Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung. Secretary General, is there anything in the NATO-Russia Founding Act that could restrict military planners and commanders when they work out these options for leaders? Thank you.
We will do what is necessary to ensure that there is no room for misunderstanding in Moscow, for miscalculation in Moscow about our commitment, readiness to protect and defend all as every inch of NATO territory. The reason why we do that is not to provoke conflict, but is to prevent the conflict. That has been the success of NATO for more than 70 years, that any potential aggressor or adversary has always known that an attack on one ally will trigger a response from the whole alliance. And to ensure that in a new security reality, we need a reset of our deterrence and defense. And that's actually what we're now tasking the commanders to provide advice on, how to reset our deterrence and defense, and we will do what is necessary. The NATO-Russia founding treaty, of course, that actually clear reference to in the current security environment. Back in 1997, we are not in the current security environment today. We are in a total different security environment. At that stage, we actually foresaw Russia as a strategic partner, working with them. Since then, Russia has invaded Georgia, illegally annexed Crimea, and now also invaded Ukraine. So we will do what is necessary, and the NATO-Russia Founding Act is not something that will create or hindrance for NATO to make the necessary decisions.
Okay, we go to Ukrainian news agency.
Dmitry Shkurko, National News Agency of Ukraine. There in negotiations with Russia is another important factor. According to the data released today from the General Staff of Ukraine, around 40% of invading forces already lost by Russians in equipment and manpower. Could NATO confirm that? And because of that, the obvious question, is the threat which Russia posed to NATO in escalation a little bit overestimated by NATO countries? Thank you.
President Putin totally underestimated the strength of the Ukrainian armed forces. President Putin underestimated the unity of the Ukrainian people and the courage of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian leadership. And this, combined with the support, the massive support the Ukrainian armed forces are receiving and actually have received from NATO allied countries over many years, have forced President Putin to change his plans and to realize that this quick victory, this blitzkrieg, taking control over Kiev within days, has absolutely failed. But we should not underestimate Russia's capabilities when it comes to continue the war and also to continue to attack, including cities. We have seen how Russia has been responsible for the same, or for brutal warfare, both in Chechnya, but also in Syria. And of course, even though they have made severe mistakes, Russia maintain a large capability of conventional armed forces, but Russia, President Putin has also, they have also used nuclear rhetoric. Russia is a nuclear power, and we have seen how they have stepped up to also the nuclear rhetoric threatening both NATO allies and Ukraine. So I think we must not underestimate dangers related to military capabilities of Russia, including their will to actually use force and impose devastation and destruction on others.
We'll go to Imedi, lady in white.
Thank you very much, Anna. Mr. Secretary General, can you tell us more about Georgia? Defense minister from Georgia attended the ministerial. You have, and you said recently that it's a broad agreement that we need to do more to support Georgia. So what options were discussed, for example, today? Thank you very much.
I think we need to realize
Am văzut discursul lui Jens Stoltenberg în cartierul general NATO de la Bruxelles, unde a dat un nou discurs. El a spus că îi ajută pe ucraineni cu tot ce pot, de la ajutor financiar, ajutor militar, dar și ajutorul refugiaților. Dar despre acest discurs vreau să discut cu colegul meu, Bogdan Nicolae, redactor șef la monitorul Apărării și Securității. Bogdan, cum vezi acest discurs al lui Stoltenberg după discursul Zelensky, lui Putin? Mai avem și pe Boris Johnson. E o zi plină de evenimente. Cum vine acest discurs al lui Stoltenberg după alte două mari discursuri ale zilei de astăzi?
Mihaela, este un discurs deocamdată introductiv. După această conferință de presă ar trebui să aibă loc întrunirea miniștrilor apărării din statele membre NATO. Evident, vor să discute situația operativă din Ucraina, ceea ce se întâmplă în teren acolo și care sunt perspectivele, inclusiv posibilitățile pe care statele membre ale alianței le au individual sau împreună de a ajuta mai departe Ucraina. Dincolo de momentul festiv, să menționăm faptul că astăzi este ziua de naștere a lui Jens Stoltenberg, secretarul general al NATO, împlinește 63 de ani. Avem un moment dramatic, este un moment decisiv, nu numai în legătură cu încercuirea Kievului și încercările repetate ale rușilor de a asedia, de a lua sub control capitala ucraineană, ci este vorba despre un dramatism care se desfășoară în planul negocierilor. Sunt primele informații cu care am început ziua de astăzi în legătură cu o posibilă înțelegere, un posibil acord între partea ucraineană și cea rusă. Și Sorina Matei a comentat un pic mai devreme ceea ce a scris și Financial Times. Este posibil să se ajungă la un acord în 15 puncte care să netezească, pe de o parte, calea către oprirea războiului, pe de altă parte să îndepărteze un conflict pe termen mediu și lung. Revenind la discursul lui Jens Stoltenberg, evident am reținut câteva lucruri foarte importante. NATO rămâne ca alianță foarte unită, solidară. Membrii săi nu au făcut opinie separată în ceea ce privește modalitățile de răspuns la creșterea nivelului de insecuritate în vecinătatea lor estică. Apoi, NATO nu se va implica cu trupe în Ucraina, nu va trimite în niciun fel oameni în teren. Apoi, al treilea lucru, este un consens la nivelul alianței că nu este momentul pentru introducerea unei zone de interdicție aeriană, respectiv no-fly zone, asupra Ucrainei sau deasupra unor sectoare din spațiul aerian ucrainean. Și dincolo de aceste poziționări ale NATO în legătură cu Ucraina, am avut reiterate pozițiile clasice. Aliații trebuie să continue să investească în apărarea proprie. S-a menționat din nou acel 2% din PIB pentru cheltuielile de apărare. NATO va consolida flancul estic și va întreprinde tot ceea ce este necesar pentru apărarea colectivă. A readus aminte faptul că NATO a adus trupe în această zonă după 2014, după ce Rusia a invadat și a ocupat ilegal Crimea și o porțiune din Donbass. Până atunci NATO nu a avut deloc trupe în acest flanc răsăritean. Este totodată reamintită poziția NATO în legătură cu obligațiile Rusiei, respectiv de încetarea operațiilor militare, de retragere a armamentului și a personalului militar care se află în momentul de față angajat în război pe teritoriul Ucrainei. A făcut un apel din nou la președintele Putin. NATO este deocamdată rezervată și nu dorește ca alianța să comenteze progresul, oricât ar fi el de nesemnificativ, în ceea ce privește negocierile de pace dintre Ucraina și Federația Rusă, însă rămâne pe o postură de precauție și poate că încurajează orice efort diplomatic posibil a se face în acest moment, indiferent din ce zonă. Știm că Turcia și-a oferit bunele oficii pentru așa ceva, știm că și alte state s-a oferit să ajute cu un telefon, cu un demers oarecare. Germania, Franța sunt printre cele mai, să spunem așa, profilate state din punct de vedere politic pentru a ajuta un rezultat favorabil păcii.
Bogdan, mai avem, vreau să discut cu tine despre Curtea Europeană de la Haga, despre acuzațiile de genocid aduse de Ucraina împotriva lui Vladimir Putin. Avem 13 voturi la 2 care decid că Rusia ar trebui să suspende operațiunea militară. Și în același timp ambele părți ar trebui să se oprească de la escaladare. Cum vezi aceste voturi? 13 la 2 pentru ca Rusia să suspende operațiunea militară. Cum pot influența cei de la Haga?
Ucraina a intentat acest proces într-o fază relativ timpurie a distrugerilor care se produceau pe teritoriul ucrainean. Totuși, de atunci și până astăzi au mai fost strânse dovezi. Din păcate, lista a continuat să crească, lista pierderilor de vieți omenești, lista refugiaților, a persoanelor strămutate intern a tot crescut. Evident că s-au adăugat dovezi până în ultima zi. Decizia aceasta a Curții Internaționale de Justiție de la Haga, care dă dreptate Ucrainei în privința condamnării Rusiei, a regimului de la Moscova, a Kremlinului, a lui Putin în persoană, în legătură cu ceea ce se întâmplă, cu distrugerile, cu crimele de război, cu genocidul care se petrece în momentul de față în Ucraina, trebuie totuși andosată la New York, trebuie discutată la Consiliul de Securitate al ONU. Decizia Curții Penale Internaționale nu este în momentul de față atât de puternică pe cât ne-am dori, respectiv nu o să-l vedem foarte curând pe președintele Vladimir Putin într-o boxă la Haga. Chiar într-un interviu pe care l-am realizat cu fostul ambasador al Statelor Unite la București, Adrian Zuckerman, am întrebat dacă este posibil să vedem acest rezultat. Președintele Federației Ruse, așa cum l-am văzut pe președintele Serbiei, Slobodan Milošević, adus la Haga, fostul diplomat american ne-a răspuns că deși multă lume și-ar dori să vadă acest lucru întâmplându-se cât mai curând, va trece foarte, foarte mult timp. Există un proces, o procedură complicată, îndelungată și dacă ne aducem aminte faptul că în Consiliul de Securitate al ONU Federația Rusă este membru permanent și are drept de veto, șansele punerii în aplicare a acestei decizii a Curții Penale Internaționale de la Haga sunt drastic diminuate. Totuși este un semnal politic foarte important. Trebuie să îl punem în oglindă sau alături de decizia adunării parlamentare a Consiliului Europei și mai ales decizia Consiliului de Miniștri al Consiliului Europei, care au exclus Federația Rusă din acest organism. Prin urmare, izolarea Federației Ruse, izolarea Kremlinului, izolarea lui Vladimir Putin și a întregului regim pe care el îl conduce și îl reprezintă este pe cale de a se produce în proporție de 100%. Mai rămâne de văzut dacă poziționarea unor state precum India, China sau alți susținători ai regimului de la Moscova întârzie să apară, dacă nu cumva se vor petrece schimbări semnificative în atitudinea lor, tocmai uitându-se la aceste decizii de la Haga și de la Strasburg.
Bogdan, îți mulțumesc foarte mult!